getting the treatment of both British citizens and European citizens to be symmetrical, to be similar.
Thank you. Order. Statement the Secretary of State for the Home Department, Secretary Amber Rudd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to make a statement on David Anderson's report published today on recent terrorist attacks in London and Manchester. The attacks which took place this year shocked us all. Our thoughts remain with the victims of the attacks and all those affected by them, and I'm conscious that many will still be suffering acutely. However painful, it is essential that we examine what happened so that we can maximise the chances of preventing further attacks in the future. At the outset, I would like to remind honourable members of the context. Andrew Parker, the Director General of MI5, recently said that we are facing a dramatic upshift in terrorist threats. And as the so-called caliphate in Syria and Iraq has weakened, Daesh has increasingly turned its attention to encouraging people to launch attacks in their home countries. Indeed, there is simply more terrorist activity, partly inspired and also enabled by terrorist propaganda and instructional videos online. Plots are developing more quickly from radicalisation to attack, and threats are becoming harder to detect, partly due to the challenge of accessing communications that are increasingly end-to-end encrypted. MI5 and counter-terrorism policing are currently running well over 500 live operations, a third up since the beginning of the year, involving roughly 3,000 subjects of interest. In addition, there are over 20,000 further individuals or closed subjects of interest who have previously been investigated and may again pose a threat. So I'd like to pay tribute to MI5 and the police who work tirelessly to keep us safe. I can announce today that they have now disrupted 22 Islamist terrorist plots since the murder of Lee Rigby in May 2013, including 9 since the Westminster attack in March this year. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to the reviews. Counter-terrorism policing and MI5 have conducted a thorough review process. I received from them 10 highly classified documents which analyse the attacks and potential improvements to operational practices. In June, I commissioned David Anderson QC to provide independent assurance of an external challenge to the reviews. And I'm today placing a copy of his unclassified assessment of the reviews in the House Library, and copies will also be made available in the Vote Office. David Anderson concludes that the reviews have been carried out in an, quote, impressively thorough and fair manner, and he endorses, so far as he feels qualified to do so, the conclusions and recommendations. Based on the MI5 and police reviews, David Anderson explains that, in the case of the Westminster attack, Khalid Massoud was a closed subject of interest at the time of the attack. Neither MI5 nor the police had any reason to anticipate the attack. Regarding the Manchester Arena attack, Salman Abedi was also a closed subject of interest at the time of the attack, and so not under active investigation. In early 2017, MI5 nonetheless received intelligence on him, which was assessed as not being related to terrorism. In retrospect, the intelligence can be seen to be highly relevant. Had an investigation been reopened at the time, it cannot be known whether Abedi's plans could have been stopped. MI5 assess that it would have been unlikely. Across the attacks, including Manchester Arena, David Anderson notes that MI5 and CT policing got a great deal right. However, in relation to Manchester, he also commented that, quote, it is conceivable that the attack might have been averted had the cards fallen differently. In the case of London Bridge, Khurram Butt was an active subject of interest who had been under investigation since mid-2015. A number of different investigative means were deployed against him, but they did not reveal his plans. His 2 conspirators had never been investigated by MI5 or CT policing. In regards to Finsbury Park, neither MI5 nor the police had any intelligence about this attack. Taken as a whole, MI5 and CT policing conclude they could not, quote, find any key moments where different decisions would have made it likely that they could have stopped any of the attacks. Nonetheless, they go on to make a total of 126 recommendations. The recommendations made in the MI5 and police operational review fall into 4 broad categories. First, there needs to be a concerted effort to enhance MI5 and the police's ability to use data to detect activity of concern and to test new approaches in the acquisition, sharing and analysis of data. Second, MI5 should share its intelligence more widely and work with partners such as local authorities on how best to manage the risk posed by closed subjects of interest in particular. We are considering undertaking multi-agency pilots in a number of areas, including Greater Manchester, and I've already started discussing how to take this forward with Andy Burnham. Third, there should be a new approach to managing domestic extremism, particularly extreme right-wing groups, where their activity meets the definition of terrorism. Fourth, there are a large number of detailed and technical changes which could be made to improve existing operational counter-terrorism processes. David Anderson ends his report with several reflections. First, that intelligence is imperfect and investigators are making tough judgments based on incomplete information. This, unfortunately, means that not every attack can be stopped. As we do not live in a surveillance state, it will always be a challenge to law enforcement to stop determined attackers getting through. Despite this, we should remember that most attacks continue to be successfully disrupted. Lastly, David Anderson concludes that even marginal improvements are capable of paying dividends that could tip the balance in favour of the security forces in future cases. Mr. Speaker, I have discussed these reviews at length with David Anderson and separately with Andrew Parker and the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Cressida Dick, as well as their senior teams. I'm grateful for all their work and confident that they have asked the right questions and drawn the right conclusions. I am clear, as are they, that the implementation of the recommendations is crucial. Mr. Speaker, there will be those who seek to apportion blame for the attacks. We should be united in our clarity that it lies squarely with those cowardly acts killed 36 innocent people this year and those who encouraged them. At the same time, we must learn all that we can from these attacks and make sure our overall counter-terrorism response is equal to the shift we have seen in the threat. Mr. Speaker, I want to turn briefly now to next steps. Bringing those responsible to justice is our priority. We must not do anything that jeopardises criminal prosecutions which are being pursued in relation to Manchester and Finsbury Park. The coroner's investigations will probe the matter further and independently access the circumstances of the deaths. Inquests have already been opened into the attacks and suspended where criminal investigations are continuing. It is right that those inquests proceed whenever they can. If the coroners consider they cannot fully deal with the relevant issues, then that is the point to decide whether an inquiry is needed, and we are ruling nothing out. I welcome the Intelligence and Security Committee's intention to make these attacks a top priority, and I've already discussed this with my right honourable friend, the member for Beaconsfield. As I have already outlined, implementation of the recommendations will be crucial, and I've asked David Anderson to provide an independent stocktake of that progress in a year's time. But linked to implementation are resources. We will shortly be announcing the budgets for policing for 2017-18, and I am clear that we must ensure counter-terrorism policing has the resources needed to deal with the threats that we face. Finally, these recommendations need to fit into the broader government review of our counter-terrorism strategy. That review reaches well beyond MI5 and CT policing to look at the whole of government response and how we can work better with communities, the private sector and international partners. I'd like to conclude, Mr. Speaker, by thanking David Anderson for his independent assurance of these reviews, and I again pay tribute to the excellent work of the police and MI5. Mr. Speaker, I end as I started. The thoughts of everyone in this House and the other place are with the victims, their families and all those affected by the attacks. I commend this statement to the House.
Anne Abbott.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Home Secretary for prior sight of the report and prior sight of her statement. And it was sad to read this report and reimagine and almost relive these terrible terrorist incidents that we've seen this year. And it must be infinitely sad for the relatives of the victims and the survivors. And as the Home Secretary has said, the thoughts of everybody in this House are with the survivors and the relatives today. This report is by way of a quality assurance of a series of internal reviews. Because, as David Anderson himself points out in his report, internal processes have potential downsides. Complacency, the concealment of unpalatable facts, and slowness to see the need for change. So it is important that David Anderson endorses, so far as he feels qualified to do so, the conclusions and recommendations of the internal reviews. Across the attacks, as the Home Secretary has observed, David Anderson notes the MI5 and counter-terrorism policing got a great deal right. But he also says the Manchester attack in particular might have been averted had the cards fallen differently. We believe on this side that is a telling phrase. As the Home Secretary noted, Salman Abedi was a closed subject of interest, not under active investigation, but the MI5 came by intelligence in the months before the attack, which, as David Anderson puts it, had its true significance been properly understood, would have caused an investigation into him to be reopened. He was identified as one of a small number of closed subjects of interest who merited further consideration. But sadly, the meeting about this was scheduled for the 31st of May, but the attack on the Manchester Arena took place on the 22nd. One of the most important recommendations coming out of this report is the need for better sharing of intelligence. Can the Home Secretary say more about the multi-agency pilots and where she believes her discussions with my colleague, the former member for Lee and the Mayor of Manchester are going? I think he'd like to know also. The Home Secretary concedes that linked to the implementation of review recommendations are resources. As we say on this side of the House, you cannot keep people safe on the cheap. She will shortly be announcing the budgets for policing in 2017-18. She talks about ensuring that counter-terrorism policing has the resources it needs. But does she accept the part in David Anderson's report where he notes that counter-terrorism indicative profile of their grant allocation over the next 3 years sees a reduction of 7.2% in their budgets? And does she agree with David Anderson when he talks about the reliance of MI5 and counter-terrorism on community policing? And does she accept that proper funding for community policing is at least as important as resources for counter-terrorism proper? Community policing is the front line of the community's defence against terror. So in closing, I'd like to thank and give our respect on this side of the House to MI5 and counter-terrorism for their great work on these matters. But we have to repeat, this does come down to resources, and resources not just for counter-terrorism as such, but resources for community policing.
Home Secretary.
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her questions, and I would just add to her point about the run-up to the decision-making on the Manchester attack, that David Anderson also said that the decision made by MI5 at the different points in the run-up to that attack was understandable, based on the volume of intelligence coming through and the operational decisions that were made. She asks about the better sharing of data. I would say that there is already substantial sharing of data, but what this review signals is that more could be done. And it is learning from the actual attacks and the attacks that have been foiled that gives the particular momentum to that initiative. Secondly, she asks about the multi-agency pilots. It has been the case that for some years people have been saying we need to do more in terms of having more information flowing across local authority areas about closed subject of interest particularly. And what we are doing here is addressing that head-on. Of course, policing, particularly community policing, plays a key role. But also these people will interact with health, with education, and what we are interested in doing is working on pilots that will address the multi-agency approach so we can really collect the information in a way that will support communities, yes, and also make sure that we have more information on the closed subjects of interest. And finally, on resourcing, I would not want the Right Honourable Lady to imply that the report covers any suggestion that these attacks wouldn't have taken place if there was more resourcing. It's fine to ask about more resourcing, and I have acknowledged that there's going to be a need for more. But I would also point out that in 2015, the government recognised the need for more resourcing and put an increase from 11.7 to 15.1 billion over 2015 to 2020 into the CT budgets to ensure that this country, through this government, is always properly resourced in this subject.
Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's a truism, but one which I think sometimes has to be remembered, that we are in no position to guarantee 100% safety for the population of this country from terrorism. My right honourable friend may agree with me that what we have to strive to do is to run a system of counter-terrorism and intelligence which is as efficient and effective as is humanly possible, so that we can provide as much protection as possible against the type of dreadful attack that we saw in the past months. In that context, does she agree with me that what appears to shine through from the Anderson report is, firstly, that there is a high level of efficiency which he was able to recognise, but that secondly there is a need for change in the way in which the work of counter-terrorism and the MI5 is linked in the sharing of intelligence, and that it is probably on that that our main focus might most profitably be directed as a committee, of which I'm the chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee, in ensuring that that is carried out. May I also assure her we will undoubtedly review what has been done in looking at the lessons to be learnt. But rather than just try and reinvent the wheel on what Mr. Anderson has done, we will be endeavouring to look at whether we can maximise the efficiency of both services.
Order. I indulge the Right Honourable and learned gentleman with some latitude on account both of his senior position in this House and of the fact that the statement referred to him. Can I very politely suggest to members that they should always seek to imitate the eloquence of the Right Honourable and learned gentleman, but they need feel under no obligation to match his length. The Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my honourable friend for his approach. And we would be very grateful for his review of the implementation phase that now will take place. And he is absolutely right that making sure that these recommendations, 126 of them, are implemented during the next year is critical to the benefits that we can get and the learning that we have as a result of this review. And making those changes, as David Anderson says in his report, could make a really significant difference in the future, potentially stopping attacks, but as he has also said, not necessarily stopping every attack.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement and also join in the tribute being paid to our police and security services and in remembrance of the dead and the injured and their loved ones and all those affected by these terrible attacks. I'd like to commend David Anderson for his usual thorough and excellent job and to welcome his recommendations and reflections, which will be studied in detail by my colleagues in the Scottish Government. The Home Secretary has spoken of next steps, and I would suggest to her that international cooperation is, of course, vital in the fight against terrorism. As we've heard in this House often, organised crime and terrorism don't respect borders, and it's essential that our police and security services can access information systems, support and technical expertise available through Europol, not only to make people in the UK safe, but also to contribute to making Europe more safe. Unfortunately, at the Security Conference in Berlin last week, Michel Barnier said that it won't be possible for the United Kingdom to remain a member of Europol after Brexit. In the light of today's report and the unprecedented threat we face from terrorism, if European Court of Justice jurisdiction has to be accepted in order to maintain our membership of Europol and the current levels of data sharing which we have, then surely the matter of security should come first and be our priority rather than a red line over European Court of Justice jurisdiction.
The Honourable Lady raises a very important point, which is about the international nature, as we saw in some of the examples that David Anderson reviewed, where we saw international travel being one of the elements that led up to these attacks. It is incredibly important that we continue to have access to the systems that keep our people and our people in Europe safe. And the best way to do that is to continue to have the sort of close relationship that we have with Europol and with other of the instruments such as SIS2 and the European Arrest Warrant. That's why we proposed a third-party treaty, which we hope, dock into the EU. We can continue to work with European Union countries and make sure that we keep their people safe and our people safe. And I'm hopeful that we will be able to arrive at such an agreement. Early indications in my conversations with other Home Secretaries across Europe are that we can do that. And I would say respectfully to Monsieur Barnier that I disagree with his interpretation that the UK is stepping away in any way from keeping Europe safe. We remain just as committed to making sure that we keep Europe safe, and that reflects our view as from the Home Office point of view and also from the government point of view.
Keith Simpson.
Can I ask the Home Secretary, and I have to say that I'm also a member of the Intelligence and Security Committee, two questions. The first is that resources are obviously crucial, but it's also in terms of intelligence, the way in which they are able to cope with the changing threat. Does my right honourable friend think that the intelligence agencies are capable of making that move? And secondly, we have had examples in the past of recommendations about implementation, and they haven't happened. How is she going to make certain that the implementation in the Anderson report are actually carried out?
Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend raises two important points. In terms of are the intelligence agencies capable of making those changes? Yes, they are capable of making those changes. That is why they have done such a thorough review themselves, and as David Anderson says, they have really released information to him. They've been very candid in their approach, and they have shown themselves very willing to embark on the changes that are needed. In terms of the assurance that we all want to make sure that the recommendations are actually implemented, I'm pleased to say that David Anderson has agreed to participate in that, and that will make sure that the external the review continues with external assurance from him. But I would also say to my honourable friend that I very much hope that his committee will play a role in ensuring that implementation takes place as well.
Vic Cooper.
I join the Home Secretary in condemning the terrorists who commit these vile attacks and extending our thoughts to the families affected, and also paying tribute to the work of MI5 and the police, because they have very difficult judgments to make, which they make with integrity and great expertise. And I welcome their willingness to reflect on where there might have been an operational response that needed to change or needed to be improved, and we have to enable them to do that. I've raised with her before my concern about whether Salman Abedi should have been on watch lists in that case. Could she tell me now, in the light of this report, what action she'll take to ensure that there is better cooperation between MI5 and the Border Force in all cases where suspects should be on watch lists in future?
Stay.
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her question, and she is right that there has been an unflinching look internally by the security services to see what they could do better, and we all, I know, welcome that. She raises a very interesting point, and that is an area which also covered in the report where we must do better. We must have better alert systems in terms of people coming and going, and ports alerts will be one area where we will see a marked change.
Steve Fraser.
Mr. Speaker, the Shadow Secretary of State referred to resources. Resources isn't just money, it's also powers. I had the privilege of sitting on the Investigatory Powers Bill Committee. Does the Secretary of State think that the powers that that Act has brought has helped the security services throughout the 22 attacks that she's identified?
Secretary.
I thank my honourable friend for drawing attention to that very important element of what assistance we can give the security services and the police in order to keep us safe. She is right, the Investigatory Power Act is crucial in that, but also I would like to say that we are looking ahead to a new counter-terrorism bill next year to make sure that we can have additional, carefully thought-out powers to keep people safe. And I do hope that the Right Honourable Member and her team will consider supporting us in that, because keeping people safe should be such a priority.
Sir Edward Davey.
And I strongly agree with the Home Secretary that all our thoughts are with those affected and suffering from these vile crimes. In September, the Met Police Commissioner, Cressida Dick, said that counter-terrorism work, and I quote, puts a strain not just on counter-terror police, but neighbourhood officers and all our officers and staff. Does she agree with the Commissioner?
Home Secretary.
I bow to no one in the admiration I have for the work that the police do in supporting the counter-terrorism policing and the security services. The work that they do is an absolute critical part of defending this country and of dealing with counter-terrorism. And we recognise that the shift in the increase in the number of threats puts additional strain on them as well.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Home Secretary's statement and particularly her reference towards the evolving threat we may see as the caliphate that Daesh declared now collapses. Given this, what work is she planning to do with our Five Eyes partners on an international level to tackle this emerging threat?
Yes, that is such an important point, because a lot of the radicalisation of these people does take place online, which means that we need to have an international approach to make sure that more of that information is taken down to stop people internationally becoming radicalised. And it's actually the Five Eyes that have been leading on this, and the relationship that the UK has, particularly with the US, that has led to the first global internet forum for counter-terrorism being set up in the summer of last year, which is leading the way in making sure that the sort of information that we all want to see taken down is indeed removed.
David Hanson.
The Home Secretary has rightly pointed to the fact that over the last 12 months there's been an increase in attacks by right-wing extremists. She's indicated in her statement today that she plans a new approach to tackling this domestic extremism, which again I'm sure the Intelligence and Security Committee, on which I also sit, will look at. Could she give some indication today of how that new approach will manifest itself?
Yes, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question, and I know that he does great work sitting on the ISC as well, which is going to provide such an important oversight over this report. It is one of the recommendations that clearly comes out of it, that extreme right-wing terrorism should also be overseen, engaged with MI5 in a way that international terrorism is. That's the recommendation, and there are some clear implementations that go alongside it, and we will be following up with his committee and with the security services to ensure that takes place.
Rebecca Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I to welcome the statement today. But also, one of the main strands, one of the main planks is about data and about sharing data, but also about checking for concerning activity. So could the Home Secretary update the House on whether she's having talks with internet companies about their platforms in terms of being used for terrorist purposes?
Home Secretary.
Yes, I thank my honourable friend for that. And we are all aware in this House, and it has come up on a number of occasions before, that we all want to make sure that the internet companies do more to take down the potential radicalising material, and also engage more with the security services to tell us where people are looking at them or buying things that could help to create the sort of dangerous bombs that we've seen take place before. There is a lot more we can do with them, and I hope that they will help engage with us to make sure we can actually deliver on that.
Any Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On that exact theme, in terms of put the pressure on the social media providers, what more can we insist on as a nation state? What more do we have to do internationally? Because what is clear is that if we get the partnership right, this can be material in defeating the terrorists. If we don't get it right, frankly, the social media providers are negligent in their responsibilities and ultimately responsible for the terrorist attack and potential death.
Yes, I mean, that is such a good point. It is one that governments are trying to make the whole time to the social media companies. And I am encouraged by the work that we've seen so far, but in no way complacent. Today we saw Google announce that they would be putting additional investment. Many of the larger companies have said they are beginning to recruit many more people, hundreds, sometimes thousands. And critically what they're doing is investing in machine learning so that the videos that we all hate, we don't want to see, the information that's up there that creates the radicalisation of some of these young people, doesn't have to be seen by people to be taken down first. What we really want is for them to invest in machine learning and artificial intelligence so that the material is taken down before it is seen.
Speaker, I would like to thank the Home Secretary for her statement today, and I wondered if she could just briefly update the House, in view of the statement, on some of the work that the Government is doing to combat the terrorist threat from these really extreme right-wing groups.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can tell my honourable friend that any sort of terrorism is the sort of terrorism we want to stop, and that is extreme right-wing or any type at all. And that is why I was the first Home Secretary to ban an extreme right-wing group last year, National Action, and I will make sure that we always prescribe groups where we have due cause to do so.
Kevin Jones.
Mr. Speaker, the head of the German intelligence agency this week has raised his concerns and his agency's concerns about those returning from Syria as the Daesh heartland is degenerated. How confident is she that the important intelligence cooperation, not only Germany but our European partners, will continue into the future?
Yes, well, we share the concerns that most of my opposite numbers throughout Europe have about returning foreign fighters. And we are vigilant about making sure that where we know that they are coming back or where we have information, we track them, we restrict them, we monitor it where we can, we stop them if we can, and we work very well across Europe with other partners to make sure that we share information on that. I would just point out that on the intelligence side, a lot of the information shared is outside the EU through the counter-terrorist group.
Pritchard.
Speaker, it is right that the government has increased funding for GCHQ, the Security Service and the Secret Intelligence Service. She mentioned announcing new police budgets soon. What can the government do to encourage chief constables and mayors of cities and police and crime commissioners, places like West Mercia, West Midlands or indeed Greater Manchester, to ensure that those police budgets are targeted in such a way that they support regional and smaller special branch units, not just the national agencies?
Secretary.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question, and he is so right that it's so important not to lose sight of the local support and the local impact that is needed. So I would say that from 2015 we set up the counter-terrorism units, which are local units, which are based obviously locally, but also have local information available to them and the sort of local community-based engagement that I know everybody in this House expects to see.
Jack Ramey.
Mr. Speaker, the Home Secretary and the Shadow Home Secretary are absolutely right. This House stands firmly in opposition to the terrorism that has scarred Manchester and London earlier this year. Can I ask the Home Secretary this question? In a welcome move, she has made the resources available for the Greater Manchester Police on the dealing with the attack on the Manchester Arena. Will she now do the same for the Metropolitan Police, because otherwise they might face a bill of up to £32 million, and that will mean fewer police officers going forward?
Mr Speaker, we did, as the honourable gentleman says, make available to Manchester, and my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, was absolutely clear that we would do that, and we have done that, and we will look very carefully at the proposal from the Mayor for London to see how we can assist. We have to see the evidence first, but we are likely to give the same sort of support.
Charles Watling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that our security services are second to none when it comes to being proactive through the use of such initiatives such as Prevent, without which we'd probably be far worse off?
Yes, I mean, it's an interesting point from my honourable friend that we do need to safeguard individuals who might become victims themselves of radicalisation. And the Prevent programme strives to do exactly that and has diverted, between 2015 to 16, we think over 300 people through the Channel programme who might otherwise have sought to do us harm on the streets.
Stephen Doughty.
Speaker, can I have my tribute to that of the Home Secretary, not least given the experiences we've had with Islamist extremism and far-right extremism in my own constituency. But as the Chair of the Home Affairs Committee said, there have been concerns raised about individuals travelling in and out, both in the case of Salman Abedi and also in the case of one of the alleged attackers in the London Bridge attacks, who was apparently detained by the Italian authorities in Bologna, and that was reported to the UK. So could the Home Secretary say a little bit more about the plan she has to strengthen checks at the border and the sharing information, particularly with regard to exit checks as well as with entry?
Home Secretary.
Well, I think the honourable gentleman raises a very important part. He's absolutely right, though. In two attacks, there is evidence of the attackers moving around. And as is highlighted in the report, we need to do better at recording that information and communicating it. And in my view, that is one of the recommendations that is critical to see actually implemented, and is also one of the recommendations that actually dovetails with the general recommendation of better use of data. So I hope that by accessing that sort of information more effectively, more efficiently, it'll be one of the incremental improvements that will help to keep us safe.
Mike Wood.
Thank you. My right honourable friend's department will have received a letter from West Midlands Mayor Andy Street on police funding that I hope she will consider appropriately. But will the Home Secretary also ensure that local police forces, including my local force in the West Midlands, have all the resources they need to do their important counter-terrorism work?
Home Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And of course, police budgets are shortly to be set for 2018-19, coming up in the next few weeks before Christmas, and I'd like to reassure my honourable friend that we will also always bear in mind the needs that the police force have in dealing with counter-terrorism as well.
Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I echo the tributes being paid to the police and the security services and the comprehensive report that has been brought forward to the House today? Can I also agree with the Home Secretary that data sharing does seem to be a key issue here, because when it was flagged in early 2017 about Salman Abedi, this was not shared with local police services, and had those who were on the ground, who perhaps had the fuller view of what was going on in the community, had it flagged with them, then maybe further action could have been taken, and I hope she will consider that. But on resources, can I just echo what has already been said, that the front line of counter-terrorism is with community police. It's also with youth services, community groups, charities, others who operate absolutely on the front line, and we really do need to have a holistic view of that. And just in relation to what others have said, in relation to some of the costs incurred in Greater Manchester in particular, can I thank the Home Secretary for making sure that the policing budget will be fully reimbursed, and can I thank her colleague, the member for South Ribble, in working with me to make sure that was the case, and can we just make sure that we never have to ask again, and that it will just be something that is automatically done?
Home Secretary.
Well, I agree with much of what the Honourable Lady has said. I would just point out, though, that it is not just about policing. Important though policing is, important though community policing is, it is about the wider community as well, which is why we're approaching this differently and saying that what we want to have is multi-agency groups to approach it, and we are going to be trialling that. One of them we hope to have in Manchester, so that we can really work out how to best yield the information in a really supportive, positive way, so we have better ears and eyes on the ground. And I hope that the Honourable Lady will engage with us positively to support that. Thank you.
Minister Davis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Hampshire
Police recently saw in action in Hamburg, in my constituency, at Hampshire Police HQ, anti-terrorism training, and it was absolutely fascinating and deeply reassuring for my local constituents. And also it highlighted the cross-border work with Thames Valley and what had been pursued in support of London and Manchester. Could the Home Secretary, though, also look at marine threats around the Solent, the risks and the concerns, particularly coming across the water, and making sure that that is highlighted in any counter-terrorism look that she takes?
Home Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend raises a very important point. It's reassuring to hear of her positive experience on the training, but of course we are looking at what more we can do in the marine environment. We work closely with Border Force to make sure that we always stay on top of evolving crime, and I hope that we can continue to make progress there as we do in other areas.
Lady Sylvia Herman.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State for the Home Department, the Home Secretary, will be very well aware, I'm sure, of the continuing very serious threat from dissident Republicans in Northern Ireland. We also have no Assembly at the present time. We have no Justice Minister. So may I just urge the Home Secretary, for whom I have enormous regard, that in reviewing finances for those police forces that have to tackle terrorism, that the PSNI, the Police Service of Northern Ireland, will also receive additional funding in its counter-terrorism role. It's not the other budgets that are controlled by the Assembly, but in its counter-terrorism role, PSNI should have further funding.
Home Secretary.
Well, the Honourable Lady makes such an important point. I am aware, of course, of the ongoing terrorism attacks that have been taking place, and we take it, obviously, incredibly seriously, as we do any terrorism throughout the country. And I take seriously very much the point that she has made regarding making sure there is sufficient funding.
Heidi Alexander.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Home Secretary has talked about the processes the authorities follow when new intelligence becomes available about closed subjects of interest. Can she say what, if any, changes have been made to that process in the last 6 months?
Home Secretary.
Yes, well, I would like to reassure the Honourable Lady that this is not a case of stopping, pausing, doing the review and making the changes. As is shown actually in David Anderson's report, which I've just put a copy of in the library, there are a number of changes which MI5 have already started to act on, and one of them is the one that several honourable men and women have raised today, which is about the ports alerts, that we are already making sure that action is taking to make improvements as set out in the report.
John Woodcock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With British combatants already arriving back on these shores after having fought for Daesh in Iraq and Syria, will she fast-track the new terrorism bill, and will she consider including a decision to reverse this government's call that permanently lowered to 14 days the limit on pre-charge detention? The whole House will agree on the government's position, which is that these people should face trial. But is there not a significant danger that many will be allowed to roam free in their communities while the government and law enforcement agencies build a case against them?
Home Secretary.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his support for the CT bill, and we have already announced a number of changes that we will be bringing forward in the CT bill to make sure that we have tougher sentencing so that the convicted terrorists stay away for longer, and a series of other elements that will be included in it, which is, for instance, that downloading, not just streaming your videos online of radicalisation, will also be a criminal offence. The Honourable Gentleman makes an interesting point. I will have to come back to him on that. But what I overall welcome is his support for a CT bill, because I am not convinced I'm going to get it from the whole of the opposition. So I will single him out as somebody who's going to support us and help make sure that we have it.
Clive Efford.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Home Secretary has to accept that £1 billion worth of cuts to the Metropolitan Police has impacted on counter-terrorism. She said in her statement that she intends to increase funding for counter-terrorism, but can she guarantee that that will not be at the essential element of community policing?
Home Secretary.
I would caution the Honourable Gentleman for suggesting that resources have had and are in any way to blame a part of what we have seen here, which is the attacks this year, the ones that have been foiled and the ones that haven't. And if he takes a careful look at the document, it's only just been placed in the library, so I expect he hasn't yet, he will see that there are clear recommendations and issues, and they are not specifically to do with resources. But what I have said is that we recognise that there has been an upshift, as David Anderson called it, a change in the amount of attacks that we are seeing in this country. And that will require not only a change in powers, the CT bill that we've been proposing, but also the potential for additional resources.
Mike Kane.
Every Greater Manchester MP, Mayor Andy Burnham and the leader of the City Council, Richard Leese, have signed a joint letter to the chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee expressing our concern that Salman Abedi's name was shared with our colleagues in America, subsequently leaked, which placed the Chief Constable, Ian Hopkins, and that investigation into an intolerable situation. Does the Home Secretary share our deep, deep concern on this matter?
Well, Madam Speaker, I would say to the honourable gentleman that many of us raised that issue with our opposite numbers, not least my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister. Those sort of leaks are completely unwelcome and inappropriate, but I would say that we mustn't nevertheless underestimate the incredibly important close relationship we have with the US in terms of intelligence sharing, in terms of support, and we must be cautious under any eventuality of endangering that. That sort of close intelligence sharing serves lives in this country.
Peter Grant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Every day, Madam Deputy Speaker, we are bombarded on the pages of mainstream newspapers and websites and elsewhere with a torrent of language which is hate-filled, intolerant and sometimes downright violent. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that that in itself is a form of non-violent extremism? And does she believe that we've got the right balance between respecting the right of speech and the right of freedom of expression, but at the same time preventing those freedoms from being abused in a way that inevitably incites others to convert violent words into violent actions?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, that is a very big question indeed as to whether we've got the right balance. But from a legislative point of view, we will always look carefully to see what is inspiring people to take violent action, and where we can, we will take action against it, such as prescribing national action and making sure that we take action wherever that comes up. But I would just like to say that one of the critical things that we have to remember is the victims here, the victims who are the ones who have suffered from this attack, the victims who and their families, and we will always make sure that we take whatever action we can to make sure that they are well supported, as they always will be under this government.
Point of order, Neil Griffith.